You're tuned into The Air We Breathe, a conversation on how we can fight climate change and sustain a cleaner environment with Bennie Lee Williams and Lori Collins right here on Watch LOTUS X.
So good to see you, Benny.
Yes, yes, yes,
I've
yes.
got a
Here
good
we.
weekend. All right, so today we have a very exciting topic. We're going to talk
Okay.
about metrics. So essentially, we're trying to understand when people are trying to set goals around climate change and manage their risk around climate change, how do they measure it? What are their metrics? How do they set targets? So I'm going to just give a little background on what some of the metrics are when we talk
Mm,
about setting climate goals. And I'm going to talk about both quantitative metrics, which is the first thing that comes to my mind, and how you're setting numbers. But there's
right.
also a lot of qualitative metrics that I think could be interesting to explore. So we'll talk first about some of the quantitative, what are the numbers? How do people set those? And I have talked a little bit about an organization called CDP. CDP originally stood for Climate Disclosure Project when it first started. But at this point, it's a lot more than a project, and now it just goes by CDP. So if you're in this space, you're going to hear about CDP.
Mhm.
Over 6,000 companies, actually almost 7,000 companies report to CDP every
Wow.
year, which is great. I mean, that's a really good start. And we talked a little bit about companies may be hesitant to report their climate metrics or their climate goals because then they feel that they are out on a limb. You know, they've talked about some risk. The next question is going to come, what are you doing about the risk?
Mm,
Or they may be hesitant to set a goal that they are concerned they can't meet. And I've heard companies talk about this in different ways. Some companies will say, we want to be sure we can hit the goal, that we've
mhm.
got like a vision how we're going to hit that goal, or we've already got some traction that makes us pretty confident. We want to be sure we can hit the goal before we go out to the public and our investors and our consumers. We don't want to put a goal out there that we can't hit. Now, other companies will say, we're going to go for an aspirational goal. We're going to shoot for the moon. And if we don't make it, that's okay, because we rather like put a big aspirational goal, a moonshot, and go for it. We think that's more inspiring to our employees, to our customers. So companies have different philosophies on that, which is okay. So I think for almost 7,000 companies to be willing to put their goals down, that says a lot. Some may be more ambitious
Yeah.
than others. And another thing that I learned when I was just looking into some information, sometimes the companies will report their emissions, and sometimes they are not really sure that they can track all their emissions. So CDP will supplement that with their own data that they get from other sources and their own modeling. And that's another motivation, I think, for the companies to figure out how to make it work, because of course you'd rather be totally in control of the numbers that are representing your company. But for the most part, the companies are doing it themselves. So let's talk about what are some of the metrics. The top of the list is just reporting your total emissions. How many gigatons of carbon? What are your total emissions? And that can be really hard to measure, as you can imagine, to look at all your emissions from your operations. It's tough, but these 7,000 companies are doing it for the
All
most
right.
part. And in some ways you think, okay, if I told you how much emissions a company had, would that tell you anything? It's hard even for me, and I'm in this space, to put it in any kind of perspective. Some
Right.
big number, what does that really mean? But that's a starting point for companies, because I think the philosophy is what you can't measure, you can't manage. So if companies make an effort to measure it, that means they have to go through all their operations, and it helps them understand where it's coming from, and then they will get some ideas about how to manage it better, how to
Mhm.
reduce it. And then around setting targets, there are lots of different ways to set targets. And the best way, the preferred way, if they can do it, is to set a target for what they call absolute emissions.
Mm,
So whatever your total emissions are, your company is going to try to reduce that over some period of time. Now, not every company is comfortable with that, because what if they're growing?
Mm.
So if the company's growing, they could do a lot of things to hold their emissions down, but it's going to look like a bigger number if they're growing a lot. So the alternative, if you feel like you're growing too much and it's just not really fair, and not motivating to set absolute emissions, they can set a goal around intensity, carbon intensity.
Right.
And that means that you're looking at your total carbon emissions relative to something else. So relative to your operations, for example. And that that's a way for a company to make some effort in a way that they feel like is more manageable. So they can say, I'm going to reduce my intensity in my operations. So even if my absolute emissions is growing because we're building more manufacturing, and we're growing, still within that growth, we're getting better, we're getting more efficient, or either we're getting more efficient or we're switching to more renewable energy, so that it's either efficiency or just reducing the carbon by switching to more renewable energy. So that's an option for companies. So now I'm going to get into another topic that's
Okay.
getting a little wonky.
Uh-oh.
But if we're going to talk about goals and
Yes.
carbon, we have to go where I'm going.
We have to go there. Let's do
We
it.
have to go there. So in my world, this is like common talk, but so there's 3 types of emissions: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3.
Okay.
And this may sound like I'm getting into the weeds, but I feel like if we're going to have a discussion on metrics, we really need to touch on this, the 3 big buckets of emissions.
Okay.
Scope 1 means you're actually creating emissions on site. So, like in your house, if you have the gas grill going in your backyard, or you have a gas cooktop instead of electric, that's scope 1 emissions. You're creating carbon emissions right in your house. You're generating the carbon or the methane. Okay, so that is scope 1, as opposed to scope 2, which is essentially electricity. You're buying it. So the actual coal or natural gas is being burned somewhere else. It's not on your property. It's being burned somewhere else, and you're buying it.
Gotcha.
So you could argue, who really cares, scope 1, scope 2? I mean, it's all sort of the same thing, but in this world, they're managed differently, and they're
Right.
different. And does that make sense between?
No, I think they both matter, because one obviously is the creator and the other is kind of just a conduit.
Right. So in terms of maybe some of the strategies you would use are going to be a little bit different. So obviously you have the most control over scope 1.
Right.
For example, I mean, I love my gas cooktop, but the reality is, it may be for my personal carbon footprint, maybe I should go to electricity. And this is interesting to me. I was asking somebody about this last week. I was on a session around electrification. If I switch to an electric stove, it automatically almost for sure reduces my emissions. Now I would think, well, what if the electricity is not coming from 100% renewable energy, which is probably not. But apparently, most likely, it's still reducing it, because there's some percentage of that electricity that is renewable or nuclear.
Okay.
Like in North Carolina, almost half of the electricity from Duke Energy is nuclear. So no carbon emissions with nuclear. It's clean. Now there may be other issues with nuclear, but when we're just talking carbon, it's clean. So if I'm burning my cooktop, my gas stove, that is natural gas. That's 100% fossil fuels.
Right.
If I electrify it, then I've reduced, because now at least half is either nuclear, a combination of nuclear and renewable.
Right.
So, so that's one of the reasons scope 1 and scope 2 were so different, because of its scope 1, I have control. Scope two, I'm reliant on my electricity provider, whoever I'm purchasing it. Now I can lobby with them and push them, but I'm really dependent on my electricity provider.
Mm.
Now, the next bucket is really a catch-all. The next
Okay.
bucket is called Scope 3. And Scope 3 is getting a lot more attention. Scope 3 is everything else. So for a person or a business, it's everything else. So for a person, your Scope 3 emissions are all your traveling, all your airlines travel primarily.
Right.
So you're not technically buying, you're not burning any fossil fuels personally,
Right.
and you're not really buying the electricity or the fuel, but you are causing carbon emissions by traveling.
Mm.
So they call it like upstream and downstream emissions. Everything that you're either bringing in from your supply chain or you're creating by your own personal travel or your consumers. So it's a huge bucket. And when companies started reporting their emissions and setting goals, you say 10 or 15 years ago, for the most part, they steered clear of Scope 3. It was just too big, too unwieldy. And sort of the prevailing sentiment was, let's just get started with Scope 1 and 2. Let's get started where you can build some confidence, have some control, take some actions. But now there's a lot more pressure for companies to address Scope 3, this all other bucket. And it's really exciting because with Scope 3, a company can use a lot more influence and have a lot more impact if they can figure out how to tackle it and if they're willing to tackle it. So, for example, Walmart is a great example. They are starting to pressure all their suppliers, everybody that sells products to Walmart, everybody that they buy toilet paper from, whatever
Right.
they need for all their operations. And they can even think in terms of their consumers. For the most part, I think Walmart is more focused on their supply chain. So it's exciting because if a company like Walmart takes that on and starts setting goals around Scope 3, they are in a position to start influencing hundreds, thousands of other companies of all shapes and sizes, large companies, tiny companies.
Right.
So they can use their position and influence for something really good. To
Now, let me ask you a question regarding that. I just popped in my head before you moved on. How do them, is there's a general kind of with scope 3, it seems like it can be kind of loose areas of what to include in there,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know if that you're going to get to that. I don't know if I'm getting into a point that you're going to get to, but how can they manage it? What is kind of like the
Well,
standard?
every company is probably different. So
Right.
that's another thing that about it is very challenging, but also very exciting if
Right.
companies are willing to take this on. Each company has to figure out for themselves where's my biggest scope 3 impact.
Mhm.
I'm going to tell a story on this that I think is
Okay.
fascinating. So every company has to figure it out for themselves and figure out where they can have the most, where their biggest impact is, and where they think they can have the most influence in terms of their strategy. Where can they affect change the most? So a story that I think is so interesting, I may have told this before. Procter and Gamble decided they were going to tackle Scope 3. And of all, okay, huge company, of all the emissions that Procter and Gamble might have from all their employee travel, all their suppliers, everything their consumers were doing with their products, they determined that their biggest area of impact was from washing machine detergent. So when consumers were buying their laundry detergent from Procter and Gamble and running all their loads of laundry with hot water, the amount of emissions that were being used, whether, however that hot water was being heated, and
Right.
primarily from the hot water, not just the electricity to run the washing machine, they determined that that was their biggest area of impact, which I think is fascinating when you think such a huge company of everything they looked at. I'm not sure how long it took them to analyze
Yeah.
all their products, all their suppliers, all their employee travel, and they determined this is one of the biggest areas of emissions and a place they decided to tackle. So they decided we are going to take this on as our mission to convince consumers that they can get their clothes just as clean as they need to be with cold water. So they started a huge campaign around cold water, and they had to create new products. There was an internal product innovation to keep trying different products to make sure that the clothes really were as clean, that they smelled just as good, that they looked just as good, all the stains were out with cold water. Then they had to run a campaign to convince the consumers to buy the product and to actually
Right.
wash their clothes in cold water. So they had to convince consumers that it was going to be good enough, or not good enough, but as good, if not better, than
Right.
the detergents they were using in hot water.
Huh.
Then they also worked with some of the washing machine manufacturers to make sure that the way the washing machines were being built would make them perform just as well with cold water as hot water. So it was very comprehensive, and they were able to demonstrate that
Right.
indeed they had reduced hot water washing to a level that they had, a sense of accomplishment on their scope 3. Now, of course, you're not going to wipe out all hot water washing, but I thought that was such a fascinating
That's major.
story. Yeah.
That is major. And you said when was this? How long ago was this? Because I was trying to add this into my notes and see, look this up online.
I will get back to you on exactly when.
Okay, I'm seeing
I,
something around 2014.
that sounds
That sound
about right. Yeah.
okay? Okay.
I wrote about this in my dissertation, which was in 2015 and 16.
Okay. Okay.
So I know it wasn't, it
Yeah,
had,
the hashtag turn to code campaign.
Mhm,
Okay.
right.
Wow.
So that's a little story to explain what scope 3 is.
Okay.
And it is very challenging to measure scope 3. It's very
Right.
challenging to impact scope 3 because it's not something that the company is directly in control of. You have to use influence. They could control the product development aspect, but they had to influence their consumers, the people who were buying the washing machine detergent. They had to work with and influence the manufacturers of the actual washing machine. So it takes a lot more leadership, and it takes a lot more time, and it takes a lot of commitment, because you could argue, well, what did they get out of that? Did they get more sales? Maybe, maybe not. So it takes a lot of commitment uh, to a higher purpose and to what their values are. So
Yeah.
that's my scope 1, 2, and 3 overview. Now, believe it or not, I found an old CDP report from probably 2015,
Okay.
looked at it again. Companies not only have to break down their emissions by scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, then they do it by country.
Oh wow.
So if you're operating in lots of different countries, how much emissions in each country, then break it down by business line or business division. So think about how much work and effort this is to calculate that, and almost 7,000 companies are doing it. So it's a huge commitment.
Yeah.
And I think it's something to be celebrated. I mean, we have a lot of work to do to reduce emissions, but the fact that that many companies have embraced it, have figured out how to calculate it,
That is
it's something to be celebrated.
Yeah, that actually does blow my mind, because when you really sit back and understand what it takes to put all that together, the workforce, the teams, the different tasks that it takes together, different we talk about and analytics. Good gosh,
Right.
just analyzing everything and the data that comes along, that's a lot of work. So
It is.
that actually does blow my mind.
Mhm. And it's something to be to be hopeful about that if that
Yes.
many companies are embracing it and have figured out how to do it. It's been, a process over time for companies to figure out how to do this. And they learn from each other. They have meetings together. They share where they're running into trouble and some of their best practices. There's, different tools that help them do it, and CDP pulls them together and lets them share ideas. So there's a lot of work, and I think it shows a lot of commitment from all of the various companies like CDP that have made it their mission to get more companies engaged in this. And we talked about how slow change can feel sometimes, and it just feels like drip, drip, drip. Is anything really happening? Is change really happening? When you look at something like that over a 5 or 10 year period,
Mhm.
you see that it's getting tons of momentum. It's almost expected from Fortune 500 companies, the
Mhm.
big ones, that they will report. So one other thing I wanted to touch on, I'm not going to go into too much more detail on these quantitative metrics,
Okay.
but I did want to note that there's also metrics that are qualitative.
Right.
And I think some of the qualitative metrics are also very important. And I'm going to give you several examples. Again, directly from the CDP questionnaire that goes out to all these companies, and 7,000 companies or more send it back. There's questions like, what is the highest level of direct responsibility for climate change action in your organization? Is it a junior manager buried, in the organization that doesn't get a lot of support? Is it the CEO? Is it
Mhm.
someone on your board? And all this
Like
is
that.
publicly reported. Next question.
I love that question.
Mhm. Are there management incentives for setting and achieving climate change targets? Yes. Tell us more. What are the incentives? So they're
Right.
really drilling down. Are they meaningful incentives? Are they going to get promoted? Are they going to get a bonus? Tell
Mm.
us more. What are the incentives? So they don't get CDP doesn't let the company get away with just saying, "Oh, sure, yes,
Right.
we
Right.
incent them." Another question: how far into the future are risks considered? So that's somewhat quantitative because you have to put down a number of years.
Yeah.
How do you prioritize your risk? Tell us your
Mm.
process for prioritizing how you're going to respond to all these various risks. Um, do you engage on policy? How do you engage on policy? Do you work with other NGOs? Do you work with trade organizations? How do you engage on policy around climate action or things like renewable energy, clean energy, et cetera?
Right.
Do you publish your information on your climate change responses and targets? How do you publish it? Do you publish it to investors? Do you publish it to your customers?
Mm.
Um, and then another thing that I thought was interesting, they ask, have you identified your climate change risk? And one company I was looking at said, or have you identified risks that could substantively change your business operations, revenue, or expenditures? And
Mm.
one of the companies I was looking at, a very big multinational company, said, no, we don't think we have any climate risk that have substantive impacts on our operations, revenue, or expenditures. So the next question was, elaborate, tell us
Right.
why. And actually, for really big multinational companies, usually they feel that they have redundant operations. So if there's a risk in one place, they have redundancy. They can just move that part of the manufacturing or supply chain somewhere else, and
Mhm.
that's usually the main reason. But these questions are really digging down. They're holding these companies accountable to explain
Definitely.
their process, their strategy, and I think that's very interesting to get so the company has to write it down. And if you say no, You either say yes and you explain what those risks are, or you say no, I don't have any risk. And then you have to explain, why do you not think you have any risk?
Right.
And maybe it is a valid a response, like redundant operations. So those are some of the qualitative metrics that I find just as important as the quantitative. Like,
Yes.
who's responsible in your organization? I love that one.
Well, I think once you, like you said, accountability, the qualitative questions allow it to be the accountability to
Mhm.
the scope one, scope two, scope three, especially scope three,
Right.
I can see that now that kind of answers some of my questions towards scope three because there's a lot of gray area in there how you can manage that and how you can really make it look.
Right.
But with the qualitative questions like those, you yeah, you got to be very transparent.
Right. You have to be transparent.
Yes.
And it's okay if you think you don't have these risks, but explain to us why you don't consider it a risk for your organization. And
Hmm.
that's fair game. Maybe it's not a risk. And so that I think that maybe is enough for today. I've
Yeah.
got one other piece that I could elaborate on, but
Okay. What?
it,
Well, how long is it?
well, I think I can touch on it actually.
Okay. Let's do
Okay.
it.
All right. One other thing that I thought I
Bonus.
would give another what?
The bonus.
Okay, this is a little bonus. This is also and gets into having an example. So
Okay.
we talked about some quantitative risk. It was the first thing we talked about, and we've also talked a lot about investors and how investors look at these risks. So I was looking at something this afternoon around how real estate investment trust can manage their risk, and these are some of the tools that have come out or in the market. So there's one tool that a real estate investor could buy. It's something that it's a product, one of these data climate data products that's available. So the product looks at 6 hazards related to climate: heat stress, water stress, which is basically drought, floods, cyclones, sea level rise, and wildfire. Then they have in their database 73,000 facilities all over the world. And they show a map of where these facilities are. So they're primarily US, Europe, some in Asia, Australia, a few others scattered, but mostly US and Europe. Then the company can project the climate risk for those 6 hazards and what is the climate risk of all those facilities based on where they're located from those 6 hazards between now and 2040, and they score them. And they map the 73,000 locations to each of the real estate investment trust. So they can tell you, for your real estate investment trust, here's all the risk you have. And you're a more risky real estate investment trust than this one over here.
Right.
Because the real estate in this one over here in real estate investment trust, number 2, has facilities that are in safer locations than your real
Right.
estate investment trust number 1. So it's a tool that very quantitatively looks at very specific risk for very specific facilities that are being managed in these real estate investments,
Mm.
and rates them. So I think that's emerging technology. That's a brand new product on the market. And I don't know what the adoption of that has been, but it's something that's available in the marketplace to very quantitatively project. Now, it's projecting because it's looking at what you anticipate the risk to be for
Right.
those 6 hazards between now and 2040. But of course, you need projections. You're trying to decide, do I want to stay invested in this or not?
Yes.
So I think that it's interesting to see how much is being done, and it's just a steady drip of pressure to get more companies to disclose, to get more companies to look at what these risks are and set targets and
Mm.
the risk for them for their own business. Now,
Yeah.
for 2 reasons. One, they're managing the risk for their own business operations to be healthier as a company. They're managing it for their investors to keep their investors happy. And they are managing the risk to reduce carbon emissions because that's what their employees want. They want to
Right.
know that my company is doing everything they can to reduce our emissions, and their customers want to see that.
Hmm. The awareness, the awareness.
Yeah. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
I love that quote.
Or
I
to turn
love that
it
quote.
around, yeah, to turn it around, what gets measured gets managed. What
I
gets
like that.
measured gets done. Yeah.
I like that. And I like how you referred to earlier. I had an analogy in my head. It was when you were talking about the emissions, and it'll come to me later and I have to say it to you. But I had a perfect analogy when I was able to relate what you were saying. I was like, I see what's going on there. So I had to think of it and let it come, it escape the mind. But I love what you measure is what you can manage.
Yes, that's an old familiar adage, but it really makes sense here.
Definitely, 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 definitely. All right. So that I know that kept off our as far as talking about governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets.
Mhm.
So that was a nice series that you can go in and kind of really understand how this process works. Because we all think about climate action. How does this even work from top to bottom with companies, and how are they even looking at this? Are they just saying, hey, we're not putting bad liquids, or we're not doing anything to the ground? But it's a little bit more than that, and it's a little, the
Mhm.
process and the what goes into it is a little bit more than that. So thank you.
And I think everybody, listening should feel comforted to know that even though we certainly haven't solved the climate problem,
Mhm.
there are very specific actions that can be taken. It's not a huge amorphous problem that you don't know where to start. We do know where to start,
Right.
and companies are getting started, but it's complicated and it's big, but uh, it's something that we know how to tackle.
Yes,
And
yes.
the the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step.
Most certainly, most certainly.